And how have you seen consumer preferences change over the last, since you started with Progressive?
Yes, it does, and it's evolving. But because there's so much noise around that, because there's so many people in the world, that to generalise doesn't take account of the variation that has always existed and will continue to exist. But I can give you an example. So when I first started in the industry, the most valuable cut was the lamb leg of the carcass,
Yeah.
and that's now changed to the lamb rack.
Yeah.
It's first the lamb loin, second the lamb leg, hind leg that is third, and the shoulders fourth, and the flappers fifth. If you go into China, they don't, or Greece for that matter, they don't differentiate between the parts of the carcass. They don't seem to exhibit the same preference. So if you go, I went into a meat market in Greece, and if you bought a pound of lamb and you just got the next pound because they laid the carcass on the block and they just chopped it from one end and then scraped it across, and that's what you got. In China, they particularly like the flap, and they make rolls with it, and it's cooked in a hot pot. With various seasonings, and it doesn't actually sound that appetizing, but I've eaten it a number of times. It's actually good, pretty good.
Okay.
And it's the benefit for us for China in this respect was that they took a cut that was relatively low valued in the Western world, and they're prepared to pay the average carcass price for it.
Yep.
But they won't pay above average for the racks. So our advantage from New Zealand, this is a very important point for the transition from the time I entered this industry, which was 95% carcass trade and 5% cut. It's now 95% plus cut trade and less than 5% whole carcass trade.
So you're trying to find that specific preference in different markets.
Correct. So the rationale is that there's no one person in any one part of the world that values the cuts equally highest,
Yep.
relatively speaking. So by way of a broad description, we find the French racks will go to North America and some to Russia, the loins to Switzerland, the legs to the United Kingdom and France, and the shoulders to Japan, and the flaps to China. So that's a generalisation, but in general those particular countries have sectors within them that value those parts of the carcass relatively higher than people in other parts of the world. Doesn't mean to say there aren't people in other parts of the world which value them on an equivalent basis, but that's the generalisation if you actually have a look at the distribution of our trade.
Yeah.
So that's been the benefit of dividing the carcass up, because when you sell a whole carcass, you sell all the bits to one place,
Yeah.
and then therefore you're struck with the weighted average price perception of the people in that marketplace. But by splitting it up, you can put the parts and try and place them where people value them relatively higher than anyone else. Yeah, so we're just in the process now of heading towards the tail end of probably our largest capital expenditure in our history. So starting off with extension to our cold store load-out facilities to enable containers to be loaded directly from the blast freezers, so the containers actually docked in and using a container mover, which on rails, which means you get a very precise location. You can actually hold the temperature platform and you're not moving backwards and forwards. So that is still a work in progress for us to fully realise its potential. We then extended the cold storage to our beef and venison plant to enable us to maintain the chilled chain for that product, so there's no exposure to ambient conditions at any time from the time the carcass is presented into the chillers until the cartons are actually loaded on the containers. That had followed on from building a beef plant here because the deer numbers have been reducing, so the deer kill's been consolidated in fielding, and that meant our deer plant was out of work.
Yep.
And so that facility's been adapted to do rams. So those are the big ovine animals that cause damage on the standard lamb line because they're just too big. Some of the big dairy goats, the odd deer, but very few now, and then the beef, which we've introduced, which was followed then by a revamping of the boning room for beef, so that it could be aligned, and that's a system out of Iceland called Morel. There are 2 or 3 other installations. We had the first installation of this type here 10 years ago in our lamb line, and we've now extended it to beef, which gives us yield management controls as an opportunity that are not afforded by others, and complete traceability options, so we can have the carcass identified from the farmer right through, and the cut with a label, so you can look at any cut.
Yep. And
you can know exactly, by its history, we could be able to tell you which boner boned it, which trimmer trimmed it, which farmer owned it, and any other data we've collected against that carcass at the time in terms of consumer confidence. So in the last part of that. So that's completed now. So right now, in fact, we're starting this Thursday in putting in a robot, Scott Technology, robotic cutters for lamb process. So it'll take the carcass and cut it into its 3 sections and then do the French rack processing. So that investment is primarily around yield. It will have a modest assistance with regard to productivities, but primarily about yield. So there's a story for those of your students that are interested in marketing about the difference between the needs and wants that are the nice to haves and the need to have. So traceability actually turned into one of those things. There was a lot of hype about it. So, more than 10 years ago, a lot of hype about traceability, and it was largely driven by the UK supermarkets, and they're saying that we would like to be able to provide to our customers the knowledge of where this product came from. So we introduced the morale system, as I said, 10 years ago. So it is more than 10 years ago when this movement started. So I said to my customers, would you like us to track the cuts from the carcass into the carton so that you could pick up a cut and know which carcass and therefore which farm it came from? And they said yes. And I said, what's it worth to you? And they said, nothing. And I said, you must be joking. You can't tell me that you actually want it and it's valuable to you, but it's not worth anything. It doesn't make sense. And I said, what about a cent a kilo? And they said, no, nothing. So I said, well, bugger you, then I'm not going to do it. And we didn't. So the need to have, nice to have. So that form of traceability moved on, that if you could provide it, the supermarkets lost interest as soon as a competitor had the same ability.
Right.
And then it actually just became a cost of doing business. It wasn't a point of difference anymore. Mm-hmm. Now they've actually backed off it because we were always able to provide traceability back generally to a group of farmers by their standard systems without the added cost of getting it to an individual farm. So it might be 3 to 5 by using time. So by the time of production we knew which mobs had been processed in that time or lambs from that mob, and so they came from there and that had been tested. So there's that was an example. It doesn't mean to say that there wouldn't be niche operations or possibilities where you take that degree of authenticity, where you've got a claim, let's say a whole marketing story behind it, and this ability supports that proposition. Yes, there certainly is a buy local sentiment, and on the surface there's almost like a compelling logic to the fact that if you buy local there'll be less energy involved in the process, but that isn't necessarily true if you look at the system as a whole. And I know that through, I think, Beef and Lamb, there was work commissioned at Lincoln University, and others economists have had a look at the whole production system. So you have to look at New Zealand's comparative advantages, that we grow grass most of the year in most parts of the country. So our cost of production are generally lower than those people that are further from the equator and have the costs of housing and cutting and carrying feed. Yeah. So there's a whole economics around that, and the energy component of doing that. So when you do that, and fortunately for us, sea freight's been held up, and when I worked for the Meat Board in the late 1970s, the commonly held view expressed at the time was that cutting lamb probably wouldn't work because you get a less dense pack by the time you put it in the cuts and pack it into a carton, and because we're 12,000 miles away. So that hasn't proved to be true at all, that perception or assumption, because of the different prices we're getting for the cuts to go to different parts of the world, and also because as we move from 20 footers to 40 footers, and we can get 10, 11 tonnes in a container to 18 tonnes, in the single handling containerisation. And thank goodness for Archimedes, because these container ships can take huge weights and loads, and it doesn't have to be supported by a road or rail infrastructure, it just floats in the sea. Yeah. And so their propulsion or wear and tear is actually just to go forward. They don't have to use any energy to kick themselves up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Archimedes has been our friend. The other aspect is, so to put that into perspective, we can get a kilo of lamb from, I use Wellington or Tauranga to Tilbury docks for less than it costs to move it by truck from the docks to the supermarket. Yeah. So the last bit, the truck miles and through the traffic, are far more expensive on a per kilo basis because the quantities are reduced too. So those big container ships, you divide them by thousands of tonnes, the cost of running them. But a truck and the last carton, you only divide by 20 kilos. So you can see how the arithmetic can start to work. It's $20 and you divide it by 20 kilos. It's $1 a kilo for everything. Yeah. but we can move it between 30 and 50 cents, 12,000 miles.
Yep.
So that's huge. And the corollary to that distance has been that our isolation has also, in the two edge, yes, we're further from the market, but our isolation has meant that we don't tend to get the BSEs and the foot and mouth and those things, those diseases that impact on other countries, because we're far enough away. Those organisms to date haven't survived the gap. So I don't believe in all of these years that there hasn't been some that have started the journey, but none of them to date, touch wood on that one, have actually exhibited themselves in this country.
Do you think you're able to trade off that sort of clean green New Zealand image that we always talk about?
Oh, I think we do.
Yeah.
Subconsciously, and there's a proposal or a project now around the New Zealand story to look to enhance that. I think the New Zealand tourism people have certainly done that, and with their billboards, etc.
Yep.
And people generally are polite when you talk to them, but I haven't heard any. The two comments that come through is that either they say, "Oh, it's a lovely country, and I'd like to go there one day," or they say, "It's a lovely country, and I was there, and I would like to go back."
Yeah. No.
So we do have a positive image, which is helpful. We need to make more of it somehow, because we still come into price competition more so than we would wish.